finish, because otherwise, it will get prolonged and I don't want to actually go on to Vinita's time. So what I would be talking first will be about good clinical practice, and then the international guidelines, the main ones. There are plenty of them available, but just the main ones that you need to know. So when before we talk about good clinical practice, in fact, it had to be actually, it should have been termed as good clinical research practice, because it has nothing to do with medical practice. So if you look at the code and guidelines which evolved, this is more recent times. So every major event actually led to designing a code or guidelines to meet that demand. So we'll come to this particular slide later also. The Nazi experiments, all of you know about the Nazi experiments, which led to the formulation of a code called the Nuremberg Code, because the trials were held in Nuremberg. Similarly, a great event in US with regard to, using the vulnerable population, about which we'll talk later also, that led to the formulation of a report called the Belmont Report. And thereafter, the significant ones were Helsinki Declaration. Helsinki Declaration came before Belmont Report, but it was an international direction. And then the need for having different view about, how to treat the local population, the researchers from developed country to observe certain norms based on the culture and customs of the local population of the developing country was highlighted first in the National Bioethics Advisory Committee's report in 2001 of US. And then in 2002, we had two important publications from Nuffield Council of UK and the CIOMS guidelines. CIOMS is actually, you can say, the external wing of WHO, because it never makes guidelines without consultation with WHO. So they highlighted again the need for the researcher to adopt to the conditions in the developing world. Thereafter, there was actually a very important event which happened, and some of you must be knowing about this, for Comilia, that is seal, just a seal flaps. The limbs were mere flaps. And why was that? Because during the first trimester, women were actually asked to take thalidomide to prevent their nausea. And it resulted in this anomaly, congenital anomaly, which made the US FDA stand up, and the person responsible for that was Christopher Harris. Amendment of Drug Efficacy Amendment, it was called, passed by the US Congress, where one needed to establish the evidence of efficacy and safety before testing in humans, especially in pregnancy. So the first time to inform, it also, the US FDA required that that all such research should actually inform the participants that this particular research is of experimental nature, and should obtain their written consent for that. Some of you must have seen this person. He gives TED Talks, etc. So it's not that, they have been, most of them actually, you must have seen in video clips how they have adapted to the life of having no limbs. And of course, you have a sympathetic supporter in the background for that, encouraging them. So when you come to GCP application, people generally think that it is only applicable for clinical trials, but it's not so. For any research, you can apply the same principles, because it highlights the importance of documentation. So it can involve all those research projects where interventions are used involving human participants, whether it is for prophylaxis, diagnosis, or therapeutic aspect. Drugs, devices, and procedures are there, but they can be applied to epidemiological studies also, or any other study for that matter of relevance. And it binds all stakeholders. Stakeholders, by that, what we mean is starting from the sponsors, the CRO, the site, the principal investigator, the ethics committee, and the regulators. How did this begin, actually? Formerly, all drugs had to be actually marketed according to the national regulations requirement of that particular nation. For example, if you had to actually have a global market in US, you had to follow US FDA rules, regulations. If it was Europe, you have to follow their regulations, and any other country for that matter, you have to follow their regulations. So it was done step by step, which took a number of years to finish. So that led to actually when the product came into the market, to make up for all the expense that happened during that period, all these took number of years, time consuming, expensive, and this was passed on to the consumers. So healthcare became very costly, and moreover, public also was expecting that something comes into the market where they have lost all hope with the current therapeutic measures. So it was felt that one needs to harmonize these regulations, and that's how the biggies, the EU, Japan, and USA came together with representation from Canada, Nordic Group, Australia, WHO, and 6 sponsors from each region, along with representatives from health authorities and pharmaceutical companies. India was not a part of it at that time. So this is called International Conference for Harmonization. So ICH means conference here. The goal was to remove redundancy or duplication, and pertained mainly to drugs, biologicals, and devices, to demonstrate that they are safe, have quality, and are efficacious. So the main goal was, while protecting the rights of research participants, get good data, which should be credible. Otherwise, it would have been a futile research. So they made a framework, and that was conforming to high scientific and ethical standards, and that framework was laying down standards for the design, conduct, performance, monitoring, auditing, recording, analysis, and reporting. Now, this got expanded in the 2016 version, of which we'll talk later. Earlier, it was only 4 standards which are emphasized. So if you go to the website, you find these 4 words, QSEM. So when this was actually released in 1996, after that, this ICH stands for International Council, not conference. So prior to that, it was conference. Now it stands as council. So what is this QSEM? Q stands for quality, and it's for the chemical and pharmaceutical quality assurance. S for safety, for in vitro and in vivo preclinical test. E for efficacy, that is clinical studies in the humans. And M for multidisciplinary, approach, like using softwares, having uniform standards. And when you talk about uniform standards, it's nothing but your standard operating procedures, because that would be the uniform procedure that you will adopt. Each, that's a QSEM, each one is a major category. In each category, you have topic codes. We will just concentrate on efficacy. And here we'll talk only about E6, which pertains to good clinical practice. The one which got released in 1996 is R1, and 2016 is R2. So when it was released in 96, there were 13 core principles described, which stays the same way even now. What are they? First is about following the guidelines and the regulatory requirements. Because this was an international document, they said Helsinki Declaration should be followed as guideline. And whatever regulatory requirements were there in each country. When we talk of India, we have Indian GCP. Now, this Indian GCP actually was adopted from ICA GCP, WHO GCP, and ICMR's ethical guidelines of 2000. See, it's only after that that this got released. So 2001, 1 year after the guidelines came out. So ditto, some passages were lifted from the guidelines to be incorporated in the Indian GCP. From that point of view, it differs from the international one. Beneficence is, as you understand, you have to weigh the risk against the benefits and justify the risks if you feel that the research is worthwhile to pursue. So you know some foreseeable risks and inconveniences which you should actually describe. And what do you expect as anticipated benefits you should consider and weigh. Of course, ethics committee also will have a say in this matter. Participant protection is the third principle about rights, safety, and well-being, which is called RSW as an acronym. Always remember these three words you will come across these three words in most of the international documents, and they are the most important considerations and should prevail over interests of science and society. But we all know that in phase one, it is actually more risk for the participants. But when you talk about phase one, can you do away with that? No, you can't proceed to phase two without doing phase one. Adequate prior data has to be there. Whatever data is available, you have to have it. If you are going for, say, phase one, then you need to have all non-clinical and preclinical data there. Non-clinical will include, of course, the in vitro and in vivo. And if it is phase two, you have to have phase one data also there. And this is called investigator's brochure. Relevant science has to be there. If it is not scientifically sound, it is ethically bad. So this has to be laid down very well in the protocol. Independent review, I don't have to elaborate on this because anyway, Vinita will be talking about it. So every proposal has to undergo, even if you are expecting that it is exemption from, you have decided as an investigator that this should go in the exempted variety, you cannot decide that. You have to submit, that is, all research has to be submitted to the ethics committee secretariat. They will decide to what category it falls. And a certificate of exemption should be taken, because tomorrow, if you are going to publish that research, the journal is very likely to ask you for the certificate from the ethics committee about exemption. I may have to make a statement on that. 7 and 8 principle pertain to the investigator. The investigator's professionality to take care of the participants if they require that. So for that, you have to be a qualified physician or qualified dentist. So they actually describe only 2 categories, physician and dentist. But that does not mean a nurse cannot have a project abiding by these guidelines, or a physiotherapist cannot have it like that. No. The meaning is that if the patient needs some care, the investigator should be in a position to provide that. That's why the emphasis. And how should that person be qualified? It should be by education, training, and experience. For that point of view, you PGs, I think the whole audience is PGs, you guys cannot be principal investigators. Many times I have seen these proposals being submitted by DNB students and PG students as principal investigator. So by this 8th principle of GCP, you cannot be principal investigator. So who will be principal investigator? You'll ask that. So the principal investigator for the project would be the guide, because the guide has to give an undertaking that this will be this will take place under my guidance, and I'll be responsible for this, all those things. So he becomes the principal investigator and the student is the student researcher. But when it comes to publication, the roles can be reversed. When it comes to informed consent, you should ensure that it is freely given. For that, you need to communicate the whole aspect about the research and see that the person understands. So what you communicate is what is called patient information sheet or participant information sheet. And what you understand from that, that is the participant's role. So that is the ICF. So this stands for PIS, this stands for ICF, Informed Consent Form. Now, if you are not in a position to understand that, you need to have another person step in, and that is called LAR, legally authorized or legally acceptable representative. Everything has to be documented, and a copy of the signed statement should be given to the participant. There are instances where you may be taking only oral consent or audio-visual recording. So that copy you may not be able to give to them, but you have to keep those documents well in good custody, where you will actually see that the outsiders don't get access to that. So it will be a controlled access. Documentation is the most important aspect. And that is how you record is very important, how you handle that and store it. Only this will actually lead to accurate reporting, interpretation, and verification. Very important. Privacy and confidentiality, I already alluded to that earlier, that there has to be a controlled access to all the records, all your computer data, etc. Product cannot be a low-grade one. It has to comply with the good manufacturing practice. Then comes the 13th one about quality. And this is the one which determines whether the data is of consequence or has to be thrown away. If it is to be thrown away, that means your research was all futile. You unnecessarily subjected so many people to undergo whatever you were intending to do. So for this quality assurance only, you require all this. The systems with procedures, that means your SOP, standard operating procedure. Now, standard operating procedures is not meant only for ethics committee, but it also, any action for that matter can have SOPs. For the investigator, for the sponsor, everyone can have SOPs, how to go about things in a systematized manner. So when we say quality assurance, it's a big thing. But quality control is a small part of it which pertains to the particular site, whereas quality assurance pertains to the whole project. And you have the WHO GCP, which was revised in 2005. It states that clinical research practice, but look at the acronym, it is GCP. It has 14 principles, but they reflect the same thing as the 13 principles of GCP. Now, European Medical Agency wanted to find out how is the position of research using GCP. From 2002 to 2012, they studied and they found that the most weak points were about monitoring, data management, clinical study reports, and source documentation. US FDA also studied a 6-year study, and they also found that there was inadequate monitoring. They also found fault with the investigators, that they were not complying to the requirements. And also they found that the investigational product was not being taken seriously. There was inadequate accountability. Like if you were to keep it at, say, 20 degrees centigrade, it was kept at room temperature and things like that. So you can imagine what the condition of the product would be, how will it actually have its effect on the body, and therefore lead to, good outcomes can get skewed. So they worked again, and then they brought out the second revision. No, the first revision in 2016, and they called it integrated addendum to good clinical practice. So they have additional points. Why? Because the clinical trials became very complex, and then electronic technology developments were there. A lot of electronic material was being used. And in COVID, you all understand how it increased, to what an extent. And also quality management. And the onus actually rested on whom? You will see in subsequent slides. So it became a risk-based approach. They emphasized on that. So in the addendum glossary, you have other additions. This is just to, apprise you of the changes. I'm not going to describe it in detail. In the investigator's role, they added certain other elements. And then sponsor. When it came to sponsor, look at the risk thing. The whole onus of risk management fell on the shoulders of the sponsor. Risk identification, evaluation, control, communication, and so on, and monitoring, non-compliance, all these things, the sponsor was held responsible. And also the computerized system for validation data integrity. I told you, you need to have credible data. So if you compare ICA GCP to Indian GCP at that time, not now, because Indian GCP is 2001, it has been revised but not finalized yet, because it has become obsolete. Now, as I told you earlier, Indian GCP was also based partly on the ICMR guidelines of 2000. And ICMR guidelines have actually changed twice after that, last one being in 2017. So it's high time that certain aspects were included in this. But even at that time, 2001, it differed from ICA GCP in these areas, like definitions. There were some additional definitions, like escape treatment, investigational labeling, and so on. And for principles, there's a prerequisites, IRB, IEC. They also talked about sponsor, monitor, and investigator. With regard to investigator, here they added record keeping and data handling, and with regard to sponsor, quality assurance, role of foreign sponsor. That was very important addition. And statistics was given more importance. There were other things also in Indian GCP, the special concerns about vaccines, contraceptives, surgical procedures, and so on, including herbal remedies, medicinal plants, which was not there in the ICA GCP, in the investigator's brochure. And appendices, declaration of health is fine, but Schedule Y has now become obsolete. It has been, I won't say obsolete, because it has been absorbed into the new drugs and clinical trial rules. And then it also spoke about the rDNA basis, recombinant, vaccines, diagnostics, etc. Oh, sorry, this is a repetition, sorry. So the definitions, here you have additional definitions. They call sub-investigator, we say co-investigator, source data, raw data, source documents, source data. We always excel in trying to have different words. Okay, there's no harm in accepting what is already existent. But people want to show Indians are different. No, again, this is another addition. Now here, you have in ICA GCP, they describe about the ethics committee at least 5. We said 5 to 7 initially. And at least one scientist, see, at that time, I told you this is 2001. Now you have 7 to 15 here. So one non-scientific, non-affiliated, but this was not specified at that time. And chairman has to be external. That first came in the Indian GCP. because in the ICMR guidelines, it was given preferably from outside the institution. But in the Indian GCP, they made it like it was not mandatory, but they made it as a requirement that chairperson, the ethics committee, which reviews regulatory trials, should have a chairperson who is from outside source, outside the institution. And of course, a member secretary will be internal. And PI could be called for clarifications. Record retention 2 years after last approval in ICH region or after discontinuation of clinical development. Whereas this stated that it should be for 5 years after completion of study or data submission. What did not change in the two versions is about institutional review board, clinical trial protocol and amendments, and investigators brochure. Now, this is what I said, it is ready, but it has to be finalized. Coming to bioethics international guidelines now. When we talk about bioethics in our country, we can say that it was centuries ago the codes were laid by the traditional medicine practitioners. But when we talk of the Western principles, if you look at that, it developed much, much later in the 17th century. Okay. Thomas Percival is an important person because he laid the ground for the first code of medical ethics. Then, several years later, the American Medical Association made its first national code. Why I'm emphasizing on this, you will understand later. So, Code of Medical Ethics, again, 50 years later, same association made it as a Code of Medical Ethics. Now, Fritz actually included the concept of scientific use of animals and plants in that, because this is all about humans. And then in 47, again, the American Medical Association adopted Percival Code as the code that you see, Nuremberg Code. And in 60s, the word bioethics came up. And in 70, the Potter, he was a biochemist, he included biosphere, which actually was inclusion of ecology in that. So you find Fritz talking about animals and plants and Potter talking about ecology. And it was Encyclopedia of Bioethics in 72, which laid the definition for bioethics. If you look at Germany, it had very good code much earlier, 1898, 1900, 1931, and 1933. It had these guidelines which took care of the vulnerable population. But what happened in World War II? You find this terrain where the red spots that you see are death camps and the green ones were the concentration camps, of which some were used for experimentation on the captives. You see the sea here, high altitude and extreme cold. So the experiments also concentrated on that, how to make potable water, freezing experiments and high altitude experiments, which led to death. No consent taken. This is the story of Joseph Mengele. He was called the angel of death. His interest was studying the twins. You can see these twins here, all without clothes and things like that. Horrendous experiments that he did, you can see, you can read in the net. So this is one of the survivors of the twin studies.
The other experiment was also done 3 times a week, the Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. And there they would tie both of my arms to restrict the blood flow. They would take a lot of blood from my left arm, and they would give me a minimum of 5 injections into my right arm. The content of those injections, we didn't know then, and I still do not know today.
So, in 1947, Nuremberg Code, which was laid down following the trial of doctors as well as judges. So 10 principles were laid, of which informed consent was the longest paragraph. And the right of the patients to withdraw. I mean, they were all the 10 I'm not going to highlight. I'm just going to concentrate on the power that the participants got. Of course, they talked about them as subject and not participants. And also the onus was on the physician to actually withdraw the patient if he felt that there's more harm occurring. And this Nuremberg Code led to another publication from Nuremberg to The Hague. This laid the ground for international criminal justice, the future of that. And then came the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, which endorsed the informed consent process. And also they actually met 7 times. They didn't meet at 7 times. This is by World Medical Assembly. They were meeting many times. But the declaration took 7 revisions, the last one being in 2013. So during the second one, they emphasized the need to have ethical review committees, which actually laid the ground. So you have Nuremberg Code laying the importance on informed consent, and here Declaration of Helsinki laying the importance of having ethics review committee, which must be independent of the investigator, the sponsor, or any other kind of undue influence. So the proposals had to be submitted for review. Now, this is the Tuskegee syphilis study, which I was mentioning earlier, which was again a landmark event. So these were the Black poor Americans. They were suffering from syphilis, and the US Public Health Service Department actually initiated this project from 1932 to 1972. So the penicillin, which was the drug of choice, which came into the market by 1940, was denied to these people. And 1972, this came to limelight through a journalist. And so with that, there was a huge uproar in the media, and that led to the setting up of a National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. So they were actually, it took them 7 years actually to bring out a small booklet sort of thing. Okay, but it assumed so much importance in later years. The 3 principles they laid down was respect for persons. That means autonomy, right to privacy, and to volunteer freely for enrolling in research. And then beneficence, which was actually the weighing of risks and benefits led to that. And justice was about selection of participants. Now, non-maleficence was actually added later by the 2 philosophers who were responsible for this preparation of this report. Non-maleficence and beneficence, you might say they mean the same thing, but no, but they are 2 sides of a coin, and they need not mean the same all the time. Then came SAN Code of Ethics in 2017. Now, this was made by 3 groups of SAN people of South Africa. They felt very much exploited when their traditional knowledge was taken away, and they were not given the due recognition for that. And there were DNA mapping studies, and they were addressed as Bushmen in publication, to which they objected. What is this, Bushmen? So the requirements of the code that they made was privacy has to be preserved. There should be honest communication of the researchers who come with the intention of using them, benefit sharing, capacity building, and to take consent to publish photos. Anything on them had to get their consent. Review research before publication. So the San tribe leader, actually, his statement was, come through the door and not through the window. Because when you come through the door, you will meet them at on equal footing, and the intentions could be laid bare. For that, the 5 values were given importance: respect, honesty, justice, fairness, care, and process. So this laid the background for another code for EU. And this code actually was for research in resource poor settings. They worded it carefully, not as developing country, but resource poor settings, because even this can be happening in developed countries. Compare Alaska to California, or within California also, you have people dwelling on the street, homeless people. So this is the code that came out, and this is almost a mandatory requirement for the EU researchers to have research in resource poor settings. The 4 principles here are slightly different from the 4 principles you saw in Belmont report. Here also they use the word respect, but this respect is for the local culture, local researchers, and so on. One had to be fair in intent, take care of the participants if they needed that, and be honest in your intentions. Now, looking at the US scenario, so they made their regulations common, which was called as common rule in 1991. And see, it got revised only in 2018, implemented in 2019. What took so long? It was the happening of an event which led to all this. This is Susan Reverby, a historian. She was still, very curious about the Tuskegee trial and went on. She has written books also on that. Went on looking after documents and accidentally came across some documents which actually were very incriminating. It told her about this Guatemala trial, which happened between 46 to 48. So the informed consent aspect through Nuremberg Code was made in 47. Nobody paid attention to that until 48. Again, it was US Public Health Project. And there was this John Cutler who was sent to this place along with the army, which helped the US Army, which helped Guatemala to get freedom. Now, this man actually had done some experiment. He was a venereologist. He did some experiment in the Indiana prisoners first, infecting them with the microbes, contaminated ones. And then next, his experiment went to Guatemala. And after these 2 years, he was posted in Tuskegee. So you can imagine what a sort of person was posted there. Now, this led to a big, because Susan Reverby reported it. And again, this time President Obama and Hillary Clinton were in the scenario. Earlier, when I talked about Tuskegee trial finishing in 72, it was in 97 that President Clinton actually apologized for that and gave a huge amount as a compensation for that, 9 billion or so. Now it was his wife's turn. So President Obama asked his commission, bioethics commission, to probe into that. So here you can see more than 1,300 were on trial, 83 died. People were prisoners, soldiers, sex workers, mentally incapacitated orphans. And he actually used the syphilitic material directly or through sexual organs. And then effect of penicillin was studied in some. And President Obama said, study this in depth, what happened, and set up an international panel. And this whole report was actually released as ethically impossible. Several things were actually outlined there. So these were the records which were kept in Guatemala. Can you imagine? This is not the site even today in some of our institutions, most of our institutions, I may say. These were studied. How many? 125,000 pages, including 12,000 pages of Dr. Cutler's own papers that he donated to Pittsburgh University in 1990. All these are now carted in cartons to be sent to the archives. I had the privilege to visit that office as member of the Bioethics Commission Developing Country Representative. And therefore, I was given access to this photo to show that. So this highlights the importance of documentation. This is one lady. She was an orphan, 10 years old, when she was asked to spread her legs. She was called in, and she saw some white men in coat, and she was asked to spread her legs, and she did it that, out of fear, of course. And what happened was, she said, somebody poured some material into my vagina. She lived at 74 when this was being recorded. And she said, they never gave me a chance to say no. And with that, I end the narration. So this is that lady who survived. Why I'm showing her is, she said she started giving lectures about her experience in the prison camp. So she said a few years back, she actually forgave Dr. Mengele, who actually had escaped to Latin America and continued his experiment to raise an army of brunettes and blondes for his master, Hitler. So she started narrating her experiences, and she died in 2019 at the age of 85. And she said that she forgave Mengele, and with that, a big load was off her shoulders. And that is the reward of, forgiving. And here is Susan Reverby. We were fortunate for that. And this is the Bioethics Commission for that matter. Thank you for your patient listening.